The world is filled with stories of mothers who would do anything to protect their children. But what happens when that instinct turns inside out? When the person meant to nurture becomes the one to destroy? From suburban neighborhoods to quiet church-going families, these women carried a mask of love that hid unimaginable darkness beneath. Their crimes were not born out of passion or impulse, but calculation. Each step measured, each lie rehearsed. This is not fiction. These are real stories. True cases that stunned investigators, horrified neighbors, and made the world question everything we thought we knew about motherhood. Today, we uncover the most evil mothers in history, women whose names became synonymous with betrayal and murder. From Susan Smith, the mother who fabricated a carjacking to hide a crime that shook America, to Diane Downs, whose cold smile in court concealed a heart of deceit, to Andrea Yates, whose mind became a battleground between faith and psychosis. Each story reveals the same haunting pattern: manipulation, control, and the collapse of morality inside the walls of ordinary homes.
In this documentary, we dive deep into the psychology behind maternal murder, exploring the twisted motives, hidden traumas, and chilling calm that followed every act. These are not just crimes, they are case studies in pure psychological darkness. You'll hear about women who poisoned their families for attention, mothers who believed the apocalypse justified murder, and those who smiled as they watched the world search for victims who were already gone. Welcome to a journey through deception, delusion, and death, where love and evil share the same face. This is The Most Evil Mothers, the true crime documentary you can't look away from. Hey there, welcome back. In today's video, I'll take you through the timeline of the most evil mothers, breaking down the real investigations, motives, and shocking verdicts that exposed these women to the world. Drop a comment below, telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories, real-life murder mysteries, and psychological documentaries just like this one. And if you're not subscribing, tell us why in the comments. We'd love to know.
After 9 days of searching, Susan Smith confesses to buckling her boys into the family car and driving it into a lake. Susan Smith is convicted for their deaths and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Now,
the story opened with a plea that stopped a small South Carolina town in its tracks. A young mother, Susan Smith, stood in front of television cameras, asking for help to find her two missing sons. Her voice shook, her eyes glistened under bright lights, and an entire community rallied behind her. Neighbors tied ribbons, volunteers formed search lines, and prayer circles filled church halls. Reporters amplified every update, and the nation watched for any sign the boys would be brought home. From the outside, the picture looked clear. A carjacker at a traffic light, a stolen vehicle, two children taken in an instant. It was a nightmare that felt random and senseless, the kind of event that could happen to anyone. That certainty did not last. As the first hours turned into days, investigators noticed small problems in the account. Times did not match. Directions wavered. Details that should have been sharp came out blurred. The search never stopped, but the focus began to shift. Sympathy remained strong, yet the questions grew louder, and the case moved from a desperate hunt to a careful examination of a mother's story. Investigators reconstructed the route that night and checked each light, intersection, and witness call. The supposed abduction location did not line up with traffic patterns or sightlines. Officers asked Susan to walk them through the sequence again. Answers moved. Minute markers slid. The description of the assailant did not produce a single credible lead. Meanwhile, pressure built across the region as the story dominated headlines and news segments. Behind the scenes, agents studied her interviews. They were struck by calm moments at times when most parents in crisis cannot maintain composure. That observation did not prove anything by itself, but it kept the questions open. Detectives widened the lens and looked at her recent personal life. In that process, a letter surfaced from a man she had been seeing, Tom Finley. In the letter, he made it clear he did not want a relationship that included children. The letter did not solve the case, but it provided a clear motive line that could be tested against the timeline and the shifting statements. The search continued at full speed. Divers checked bodies of water, patrols canvassed remote roads, and tips poured in from across the country. Investigators kept returning to inconsistencies. They compared interviews, matched words to locations, and noted each change. When they put those elements together with the relationship stress, the case shifted from a story about a stranger to a story about proximity and opportunity. Detectives asked Susan to sit down again, quietly and without cameras. They asked simple questions, then more precise ones. She tried to hold the original account, but the gaps widened. At one point, she asked for a moment to pray. The room settled. The posture changed. What followed was not a full story at once, but a series of acknowledgments that met the evidence that had already been gathered. The narrative of a carjacking began to fall away. The investigation turned to a nearby lake that had already been searched, now with renewed focus and a specific point of interest.
The turning point arrived when the investigation returned to John D. Long Lake. Recovery teams worked methodically. The vehicle was located in the water. The outcome confirmed what the detectives had come to suspect. In the interview room, Susan admitted responsibility for what happened to her children. She acknowledged that the account of a gunman at a traffic light was false. She acknowledged that her actions at the lake led to the deaths of Michael and Alex. For the public, the confession changed everything. The same clip that had inspired vigils now felt like a performance designed to buy time and move attention away from the truth. Communities that had poured out support felt betrayed. Reporters who had covered the search shifted to questions about motive, manipulation, and the pressures that preceded the night in question. The letter from Tom Finley, the changing times, and the lack of evidence for a carjacking formed a coherent explanation when paired with Susan's admissions. The case moved from investigation to court, and the national conversation turned to accountability and consequence, not mystery. The trial took place in 1995. Prosecutors presented the timeline, the letter, the inconsistencies, and the admissions. The defense presented evidence of mental health struggles and argued that despair and instability shaped her choices. The jury found Susan Smith guilty of 2 counts of murder. The court imposed a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Years later, the case is still used in training rooms and classrooms for its lessons about initial assumptions, media pressure, behavioral analysis, and motive development. It also stands as a reminder to approach high-profile searches with empathy for victims and with discipline around facts. Public hope was genuine, the volunteer work was real, and the grief that followed the confession was real as well. The investigation's careful, steady approach is what brought a clear conclusion to a story that began in cameras and confusion. As investigators closed the file on Susan Smith, another mother in a different state was preparing to tell a story even harder to believe. A smiling parent who claimed a stranger had shot her children.
The emergency room doors slid open just before midnight on May 19, 1983. A compact red Nissan rolled to a stop at Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon. Behind the wheel was a woman who said her name was Diane Downs. She asked for help and told staff her children had been shot by a stranger during a carjacking on a rural road. Nurses and doctors moved quickly. Police took an initial statement. From the start, something felt off. While medical teams worked, Diane spoke in long, steady sentences about the route she had taken and how she had driven to the hospital. Her voice was even. Her focus seemed to drift to herself more than to the children. That first impression would matter later, when officers tried to reconcile her behavior with the story of an attack by an unknown gunman. Deputies and state police went straight to the place Diane named, a stretch of Mohawk Road. They searched the pullout and the shoulder for tire marks, footprints, anything that would support a robbery or fight. Nothing turned up. The account of the suspect shifted across retellings. Height, clothing, details of the approach, even where the man stood relative to the driver's door, all moved around. Investigators built a timeline of Diane's evening and noticed an odd choice: a late drive through an isolated area with 3 children after a visit with a friend. They logged the inconsistencies and kept going. In the days that followed, Diane spoke to reporters. Cameras caught her smiling, recounting events with a casual air. Detectives, used to parents in crisis, flagged the pose and the tone. They knew demeanor is not proof, but they also knew it can point to motive. They began looking beyond the night of the shooting. A search of her home and interviews with co-workers at the Postal Service led to a name: Robert Nick Knickerbocker, a married man Diane had been seeing. In her diary, investigators found entries about wanting a future with him and frustration that children complicated that plan. The pages laid out a theme of longing and removal. That discovery reframed the investigation. What began as a hunt for a stranger became a close-in look at a mother's choices.
While detectives built their case, the hospital fought to stabilize 2 survivors. Christy, the oldest, faced a long recovery and at first could not speak. Danny would live with permanent injuries. When Christy finally woke, the team around her proceeded with care, letting her regain trust and strength before asking anything about the night. The district attorney's office, aware that any interview could shape a child's memory, moved slowly and documented each step. Evidence in the car pointed in a clear direction. Forensic work matched shell casings to a .22 caliber weapon type, consistent with one Diane had access to. The location descriptions did not match the supposed robbery. No independent witness placed a second car at the scene. The wound Diane showed investigators was minor and in a position examiners said could have been self-inflicted. Layer by layer, the picture formed. There was no unknown assailant, no sudden roadside fight. There was planning, a route choice, and a story designed to create distance between a mother and responsibility for what happened to her children. Diane's interviews made things worse for her. She reenacted movements for television, stretching out an arm to show how she said the gunman fired. She framed the case as a strange encounter on a dark road. She kept the spotlight. Detectives recognized a pattern they had seen before: a suspect talking past the facts, trying to sell an image that could not withstand simple checks on time and place. When she was pressed again in formal interviews, her account did not hold. The same questions kept producing new answers.
The turn came when Christy could finally describe what she remembered. In carefully supervised sessions, she told the truth she had carried since that night. It was not a stranger on the road. It was her mother. She described the car pulling to the side, the engine going quiet, the sequence of shots inside the vehicle. She had survived. Her statement aligned with the physical evidence and with the motives suggested by the diary. With that, the case moved from suspicion to certainty. Prosecutors charged Diane Downs with 1 count of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and assault. The trial opened in May 1984 and drew national attention. The state presented a straightforward case: They showed the jury the timeline with the odd detour through an empty stretch of county road. They introduced the diary to establish motive rooted in an affair and the perceived burden of children. They brought in the forensic match between ammunition and the caliber Diane possessed. They called medical and investigative witnesses to explain why the carjacking narrative did not make sense, and they relied on the testimony of the surviving child. The defense tried to cast doubt on the investigation and suggested Diane's mental health and personality traits explained the inconsistencies. They argued that public reactions to her interviews were coloring the analysis, that calm under stress can be misunderstood. But the weight of the facts did not shift. The strongest moment in court was brief. Christie took the stand. She spoke gently and identified her mother as the shooter. The room was silent. Jurors listened and watched a child carry the truth of her own case. That testimony was clear. It aligned with the rest of the evidence, and it left little room for alternate stories.
The jury found Diane Downs guilty of murder and of the 2 counts of attempted murder. The judge imposed a sentence of life in prison plus 50 years, making clear that parole would be a distant possibility. The decision rested on more than demeanor. What landed her in prison were the facts. The false claim of a carjacking on Mohawk Road, the shifting descriptions, the forensic tie to a .22 caliber weapon, the diary establishing motive linked to a relationship that did not include children, and, most of all, the testimony of her surviving daughter, naming her as the person who pulled the trigger. Those elements together met the standard required for conviction. The case did not end at sentencing. In 1987, Diane escaped from the Oregon Women's Correctional Center. She was caught 10 days later. The escape attempt reinforced the court's view that she was manipulative and willing to take risks that endangered others. After she was returned to custody, security around her tightened, and the surviving children remained protected. Today, the file on Diane Downs sits in the section of cases used to teach new investigators how to separate image from evidence. It is cited in classes on interview technique, on the danger of building a case on impressions, and on the need to verify every claim against physical facts. It is also a reminder that motive does not need to be complicated to be corrosive. A diary that framed children as obstacles, an affair that would not accept a family, a night drive that never should have happened. Those pieces, tested in daylight, told the story that a jury believed.
The smiling interviews are a footnote now. The record is what remains. A mother planned a crime against her own children, injured 2, and killed 1. She invented a stranger to hide it. Forensics, a diary, and a child's steady voice exposed the lie. That is why she was convicted. That is why she is still in prison. As the prison gates closed behind Diane Downs, her story became a chilling example of how obsession can turn maternal love into something dangerous. But she was far from the only mother capable of such darkness. Next is a case that would test the limits of faith, sanity, and the law itself. Andrea Yates, the devout mother who believed she was saving her children's souls.
Andrea Yates, the Texas mom who unalived her 5 young children in 2001 while in the throes of postpartum psychosis, is still housed in a mental hospital and wants to remain there.
On the morning of June 20th, 2001, Andrea Yates waited until her husband left for work. Alone in the house with her 5 children, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary, she entered the bathroom one child at a time. Each time, she held them under the water until they stopped moving, then carefully laid them down inside the home before going back for the next. When it was over, Andrea picked up the phone, called her husband, and told him to come home. Then she dialed 911 and calmly told the dispatcher what she had done. By the time police arrived, she was waiting for them at the front door. Her voice was steady. She showed them the bathroom, the hallway, and the rooms where her children were now lying still. There was no sign of panic, no attempt to flee. She fully admitted her actions and described them step by step, saying she believed she was protecting her children from eternal suffering. Her confession, paired with the physical evidence, left no question about what had happened. Investigators documented her statements and confirmed that she had carried out every part of the act herself. That confession, along with years of psychiatric records showing repeated warnings about her deteriorating mental state, became the foundation of the case that followed. When the episode ended, Andrea called 911. Her voice was calm, even controlled. Officers who responded later described her as detached, as though she were still caught inside her delusion. She admitted to what she had done, without hesitation, showing no attempt to escape or conceal the truth. Detectives entered the home and quickly understood the scale of what had occurred. All 5 of her children had been found lifeless. The crime shocked the entire country, not only because of its scale, but because it was carried out by someone who had once seemed devoted, gentle, and deeply religious. What landed Andrea Yates in custody were her own words, her full confession. She detailed her actions from start to finish and explained in chilling clarity the belief that had driven her. She said she thought she was saving her children, that she wanted to keep them from harm. The evidence was irrefutable. She had acted alone, she had admitted it freely, and she showed awareness of what she had done, at least in a physical sense. Police records, medical notes, and her interview transcripts later showed how far her psychosis had gone. Andrea had told doctors in the months prior that she felt evil inside her, that voices were warning her to act, that the world was closing in. She had been hospitalized for these delusions, treated with antipsychotic medication, and released with clear warnings that she was never to be left unsupervised with her children. Those warnings went unheeded. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Eileen Starbranch, had written in her file that another pregnancy could be fatal for her mental health. Still, Andrea and her husband had their 5th child. That decision, combined with inconsistent medication and inadequate follow-up care, pushed her deeper into psychosis.
After her confession, she was arrested and charged with capital murder. During police questioning, Andrea spoke about her reasoning with unsettling calm. She said she believed the devil was after her children and that she had to act to save them from eternal suffering. Her statements left investigators shaken, not because of the words themselves, but because of how little emotion came with them. It was the perfect storm of untreated mental illness, religious delusion, and a system that had failed to intervene in time. The facts were straightforward. Andrea had taken her children's lives within her home. She confessed immediately to police and to her husband. She described her belief that what she did was necessary for their salvation. There was no evidence of outside involvement or coercion. Those admissions, combined with the physical evidence, formed the foundation of the case that led to her being confined. When prosecutors reviewed the file, they knew the legal challenge would not be whether Andrea had committed the act she had, but whether she understood that it was wrong. The first jury believed she did and convicted her of capital murder, sentencing her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years.
However, on appeal, the conviction was overturned when false testimony about a supposed television episode was exposed. During the second trial, medical experts explained that Andrea's actions were the result of severe postpartum psychosis, a condition that erased her grasp on reality. They testified that she genuinely believed she was carrying out a divine command. The second jury saw what the first had missed. that Andrea's actions were not born of cruelty or revenge, but from a mind consumed by delusion. In 2006, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed indefinitely to Kerrville State Hospital. That is what landed Andrea Yates in confinement. Not just the act itself, but the proof that her mind had completely broken from reality, transforming her from a mother in need of urgent care into a case study of what happens when warning after warning goes ignored. Today, she remains under medical supervision, receiving treatment for the same illness that once destroyed her family. Her name continues to surface whenever postpartum psychosis is discussed, serving as both a warning and a reminder. Untreated mental illness can turn love into tragedy when the system fails to act in time. As Andrea Yates's case closed, the world tried to make sense of how belief and illness could turn a mother's love into tragedy. But the next story wasn't about delusion or despair, it was about calculation. In Missouri, a mother and daughter would work together to remove their own family one by one. This is the case of Diane and Rachel Staudte, the mother-daughter duo who poisoned for profit.
The first two deaths felt like tragedy. Sean, then Mark Staudte, taken months apart, left a small Missouri town asking why. Neighbors lit candles and offered casseroles. The community assumed they had lost loved ones to sudden illness. Grief closed around the Staudte household, and the family's story settled into the quiet sorrow people expect after loss. No one suspected a pattern, until a third collapse forced doctors to look for something darker. When Sarah was admitted in June 2013, physicians saw a clinical picture that did not fit normal disease. Toxicologists were called in, and blood tests returned the same chemical signature found in several household products, ethylene glycol. That finding shifted the inquiry from medical mystery to possible poisoning. An anonymous tip to detectives suggested what the lab work confirmed could not be coincidence. Investigators moved in with a caution born of experience. They searched the house, reviewed purchases, and interviewed friends and family. What they found in the pantry was ordinary at a glance, but significant when put beside the toxicology. An open container of antifreeze matched to the compound in the victim's systems. That discovery set a new course for the investigation. Detectives asked questions that reached beyond the clinical facts. Who had access to the victim's food and drinks? Who had motive? And who had opportunity? Diane Staudte, the matriarch, answered as callers and cameras pressed for comment. Measured, composed, a portrait of grief. She was polite under questioning at first, but under continued interview, the story she had been offering began to shift. When confronted with the lab results and the purchase history that tied antifreeze to the household, Diane admitted she had administered the product to Mark and Sean. She described carrying out acts she would later phrase as a solution to burdens she felt were overwhelming her life. In spare terms, she told officers she had mixed the chemical into beverages and foods consumed by her victims over days at a time.
That admission alone was damning, but investigators needed corroboration and context. They found receipts and online search history showing purchases, and phone records that placed Diane at home during windows consistent with the onset of symptoms. Forensic accountants reviewed life insurance and financial pressures. Physicians testified about the clinical course of ethylene glycol poisoning, how it can appear as organ failure and be misdiagnosed when clinicians do not suspect a toxicant. Those pieces linked the lab result to a method and to intent. The involvement of Diane's daughter Rachel intensified the case. Under questioning, Rachel at first denied knowledge, then acknowledged participation. She said she helped prepare drinks and dispose of materials. Her statements detailed a partnership, not merely complicity. Rachel described pressure from her mother, but she also admitted to assisting in administration and cleanup. Detectives uncovered text messages and online posts that showed a closeness between the two women and supplied context for Rachel's compliance. She wrote about wanting approval and peace at home, and prosecutors argued that desire crossed into willingness. The prosecution presented the crimes as a pattern of deliberate, repeated poisonings carried out inside a family home. They emphasized planning, purchases and concealment, the gradual administration that masked intent as illness, and the manipulation of medical narratives to keep suspicion at bay. The state called toxicologists, pharmacists, and medical examiners who explained how the antifreeze compound metabolizes and how its presence in blood and tissues could be reliably identified. They introduced a sequence connecting purchase, administration, clinical decline, and death in 2 victims and near death in a third.
Defense attorneys sought to explain motive and to reduce culpability by pointing to Diane's stress, family dysfunction, and Rachel's youth and influence. They described Diane as a woman pushed to limits, Rachel as a daughter molded by a dominant parent. But the factual record was heavy. Statements from Diane admitting administration, Rachel's corroboration, receipts linking purchases to the household, and the forensic match between the chemical found on testing and the product recovered in the home. When Sarah survived, her recovery became crucial. She moved from critical condition to consciousness and eventually learned what had been done to her. Her survival provided a living witness whose testimony added human clarity to laboratory findings. In court, jurors saw the intersection of forensic science and human consequence. The expert testimony explained the mechanism, the survivors' and family statements described the impact, and the admitted confessions traced the intent. What landed Diane and Rachel Staudte in prison were several clear elements proved at trial. The deliberate procurement and use of a toxic compound to weaken and kill family members. The pattern of administration designed to mimic illness and evade medical detection. Diane's explicit admissions to investigators, Rachel's corroboration of participation, and the forensic evidence linking the compound in victims to the product found in the home. Those combined to show premeditation and a sustained plan rather than accidental deaths.
The trial was solemn and unembellished. Prosecutors laid out the timeline: Mark's illness in 2012, Sean's decline later that year, Sarah's poisoning and survival in 2013. They read Diane's statements and played recordings of Rachel confirming her role. Defense counsel argued mitigation, but the jury returned guilty verdicts. In 2016, Diane Staudte received life without parole. Rachel was also given life, with the possibility of parole set decades away, reflecting both her conviction and the court's recognition of her age and role. The case remains a study in how intimate violence can hide behind ordinary domestic routines. It shows how toxins that are common in household products can be misused, how medical professionals can be misled by gradual presentations of illness, and how a single tip can overturn assumptions about coincidence. What started as a small-town string of tragedies became, through careful investigation, a prosecution grounded in confession and forensic proof. Diane and Rachel Staudte are serving sentences that reflect the weight of those findings, and their story endures as a reminder that the most dangerous deceptions can occur in the most familiar places. As the Staudte case closed, investigators believed they had seen every kind of family betrayal imaginable, but the next story would challenge even that. It wasn't driven by greed or hatred. It was built on a lifetime of lies, control, and manipulation disguised as love. Up next is the haunting case of Dee Dee and Gypsy Rose Blanchard, the lie of love.
In a quiet subdivision in Springfield, Missouri, officers entered a small pink house that neighbors associated with charity events and hospital visits. Inside, they found Dee Dee Blanchard dead in her bedroom, and her daughter, Gypsy Rose, was nowhere to be seen. For years, the town had known Gypsy as a sick child in a wheelchair, raised by a mother who seemed tireless and devoted. The house had been a regular stop for well-wishers, gift drives, and media stories about courage. With Gypsy missing and a body on the floor, police feared a kidnapping. That first assumption would not survive the day. Detectives checked social media and phone records. A jarring post had appeared on Dee Dee's Facebook page shortly after the estimated time of death, a crude message that drew attention to the crime. Officers traced the post to an address in Wisconsin. They expected to find a frail teenager in need of urgent care. Instead, when the door opened, Gypsy stood on her own and walked toward them. The image that had defined her life collapsed in a single step. The case shifted from a search for a victim to a study of control and deception inside a home that had looked like a storybook. For nearly 2 decades, Dee Dee had presented Gypsy as a child with severe illnesses. She told doctors that her daughter had leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures, and developmental delays. She kept binders of medical notes and moved from hospital to hospital whenever a physician raised doubts. She shaved Gypsy's head to match the appearance of chemotherapy, used a feeding tube that was not medically required, and approved procedures that would not have been ordered if full records had been shared. Charities built the family a house, paid for trips, and celebrated a mother who never seemed to rest. The documents that later surfaced showed a pattern of misrepresentation, a caregiver shaping a false identity for the child in her care.
Inside that life, Gypsy grew up with very little contact outside the home. Dee Dee homeschooled her, controlled her diet, and kept her age vague. She told neighbors that Gypsy had the mind of a young child. In private, Gypsy read quietly and began to notice contradictions. She could stand when no one watched her. She learned her real birth year was different from what she had been told. She also began to understand that many of her supposed conditions were not supported by tests or consistent evaluations. Late at night, she found the internet, and with it new voices that did not match her mother's story. In 2012, Gypsy met Nicholas Godejohn in an online chat room. They messaged for years. He lived in Wisconsin, had his own mental health history, and was receptive to Gypsy's need for connection. Their conversation moved from comfort to planning. Gypsy described the control at home and the fear of what would happen if she tried to leave. She said Dee Dee hid her documents, limited her contact with others, and threatened to report her as a minor with disabilities if she tried to run. The two began to talk about a way out that did not involve more doctors or another move. That talk turned into a plan to end Dee Dee's control permanently. In June 2015, Nicholas traveled to Missouri. Gypsy let him into the house at night while Dee Dee slept. According to the statements and court records, Gypsy went to the bathroom and covered her ears. Nicholas went to the bedroom with a knife he brought with him. When it was over, they took cash and small items, left the house, and went to a hotel. The next day, they mailed the weapon home to Wisconsin to keep it out of the car. Gypsy then used Facebook to post a short message from Dee Dee's account. It was a reckless attempt to bring attention to the scene, and it did exactly that. Police traced the post, knocked on a door in Wisconsin, and found the pair together.
At the station, investigators asked Gypsy to explain the contradiction. She had walked into the interview room without assistance, yet the entire community had believed she could not stand. Gypsy described the life she had lived. She said her mother had forced her to use a wheelchair, had told doctors information that was not true, and had isolated her from school and friends. She explained that she feared her mother and did not know another way out. She insisted that Nicholas carried out the killing while she stayed in the bathroom.
Detectives compared her statements with messages they recovered from phones and social media. The record showed months of planning, searches for a knife, and talk about what would happen after Dee Dee was gone. The moment that defined the case for the public was simple. It was not a lab test or a legal document. It was the sight of Gypsy entering a police station on her own feet. That image erased the story that had brought national sympathy and replaced it with questions about how a lie that large could last so long. Reporters asked how so many clinics had accepted incomplete records. They asked how a child's age could be adjusted on forms. They asked whether any agency could have intervened sooner. Those questions would continue long after the courtroom closed. What landed Gypsy and Nicholas in custody were the steps that led to Dee Dee's death. They discussed the idea online for months. Nicholas traveled across state lines with a knife. Gypsy let him inside the house at night and hid while he killed her mother. They left with money and medication, then tried to draw attention with a public post. Their messages and travel records linked intent to action. Their own statements filled in the rest. The defense did not claim they were not involved. The question was how to weigh years of abuse against the decision to plan a killing.
Prosecutors charged both with first-degree murder. As the file grew, so did the evidence of medical child abuse. Doctors and caseworkers described a pattern in which Dee Dee drove the narrative and limited outside review. Friends and neighbors spoke about a house that never allowed questions. Experts explained that Gypsy had been kept in a dependent state, taught to fear the outside world, and told that her life depended on her mother. The state acknowledged that history when it came time to resolve the case. In 2016, Gypsy accepted a plea to second-degree murder. The court sentenced her to 10 years in prison. Nicholas went to trial, and a jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Those outcomes reflected both the planning behind the crime and the years of manipulation that preceded it. The sentences made clear that a killing had been planned and carried out, while also recognizing that Gypsy had lived under severe control since childhood. The house in Springfield no longer holds medical supplies or charity plaques. The wheelchair that once defined Gypsy's public image is gone. What remains are the records, the interviews, and the single step she took into a police station that told the truth better than any headline. The case is now taught as a warning about how fabricated illness can pass as fact when paperwork is layered and questions go unanswered. It is also a study in how a person raised inside a lie can make a terrible choice when they see no way out. Gypsy will complete her sentence and re-enter a world she first met through a computer screen. Nicholas will not. The crime that placed them in prison was not a mystery. It was a plan, carried out in a small house by two people who believed it was the only door left open. As the Blanchard story faded from headlines, many believed they'd seen the darkest side of deceit within a family. But the next case revealed a different kind of horror, not built on lies, but on silence. A mother who said nothing, did nothing, and let cruelty unfold until it ended in tragedy. This is the case of Tiffany Moss, the silence of a killer.
As to penalty, count 1, murder, we, the jury, recommend and fix the penalty as death.
Began with a call to 911 in Gwinnett County, Georgia, on an October evening in 2013. Officers arrived at a small apartment where a father said his stepdaughter was dead. In a trash container outside, they found what he said they would find. Inside the home, the child's stepmother, Tiffany Moss, spoke very little. She stood off to the side, eyes forward, voice level. The stillness in that room told investigators they were not dealing with panic or shock. They were dealing with something colder. The first version of events was that the child had fallen ill and died, and that fear led to a rash decision to hide what had happened. Detectives noted the tone, the gaps, and the lack of urgency. The night was quiet, and so was Tiffany. That quiet would define everything that followed. At the hospital and the medical examiner's office, the story changed. Doctors and investigators reviewed the child's weight and condition. The findings pointed to long-term deprivation, not sudden illness.
School records showed long absences. Prior reports to Child Services revealed concerns that had once removed the child from the home, only for her to be returned later. Neighbors said they rarely saw her. Relatives remembered a happy girl who had grown thin and withdrawn. Bit by bit, a pattern took shape: food withheld as punishment, isolation inside a bedroom, and a home where normal routines carried on while one child faded out of view. Police separated the adults and began formal interviews. The father, Emin Moss, admitted that discipline in the home included withholding food and that he had followed Tiffany's lead. He said Tiffany controlled the household. He said he was afraid to cross her. When pressed about the end of the timeline, he described an attempt to cover up the death, not to seek help. Tiffany's account remained short and flat. She did not offer explanations. She did not dispute the timeline. In the apartment, officers found regular groceries in the kitchen and signs that other children were fed. In the child's room, there was almost nothing that suggested comfort or care. The contrast was stark.
As the file grew, the district attorney's office assembled a case that focused on a single theme. A child had been starved over time, and when she died, the adults in the home attempted to dispose of her body by burning it. The state argued that this was not neglect by accident or a moment of anger. It was sustained cruelty, followed by a deliberate act to destroy evidence. Forensic specialists explained how the child's measurements, medical markers, and living conditions matched a long period of deprivation. The timeline wrapped around holidays and ordinary days alike. There had been chances to stop. There had been chances to call for help. None were taken. Years passed before the case reached a jury. Tiffany Moss chose to dismiss her attorneys and represent herself in a death penalty trial. Court observers had rarely seen anything like it. She declined to make an opening statement. She declined to question most witnesses. When she did speak, it was brief and without emotion. The prosecution called teachers, caseworkers, detectives, medical experts, and finally the child's father. He had already pleaded guilty to avoid a death sentence and agreed to testify about what happened inside the apartment. He told jurors that Tiffany controlled food in the home, that she isolated the child, and that when the child stopped moving or speaking, Tiffany did not call for help. Instead, he said, they placed the child's body in a trash container and set it on fire. Tiffany did not rise to challenge him. The state played recorded interviews. Jurors heard Tiffany's voice, quiet and even, describing nothing in detail and denying almost nothing outright. They saw photos of the kitchen with stocked shelves and photos of the bedroom where the child had slept alone. They heard about earlier warnings to Child Services, about the temporary removal from the home, and about the return that ended with a funeral. The prosecutor's closing argument was simple. A parent and a step-parent are obligated to feed, shelter, and protect a child. In this home, those duties were withheld, and when the child died, the adults tried to erase the evidence by fire.
The defense table remained still. Tiffany offered no closing. She called no witnesses. She did not ask the jury for mercy. The silence that had framed the case now framed the end. When the jurors filed back into the room, everyone stood. The clerk read the verdicts. Guilty of malice murder, felony murder, and cruelty to children. No one cheered. Reporters did not rush the aisle. The judge asked Tiffany if she wished to say anything before the penalty phase began. She said nothing. It was the same absence that had greeted investigators on the first night. A child had been denied the most basic care, then burned after death. The jury had heard enough. During sentencing, the state argued for death. They pointed to the child's age, the prolonged suffering proven by medical records, and the attempted destruction of the body as aggravating factors under Georgia law. The defense, such as it was, offered no mitigation beyond the record. The jury deliberated and returned a unanimous decision. In 2019, Tiffany Moss was sentenced to death. She became the only woman on Georgia's death row at that time. Iman Moss, who cooperated with the state, received life without parole under a plea agreement. What placed Tiffany Moss on death row were clear, provable acts: the long-term starvation of a child in her care, the refusal to seek help as the child's condition became grave, and the attempt to cover up the death by burning the remains rather than calling emergency services. Her silence could not erase the evidence. The stocked kitchen, the empty bedroom, the school records, the prior warnings, and her own choice to present no defense told the story as plainly as words could. The courtroom did not need a speech to understand the harm done.
Today, Tiffany Moss remains on death row, her case a reference point in training for social workers, teachers, and law enforcement about what repeated warnings mean and how silence can hide the worst kind of neglect. The lesson is not complicated. Children cannot feed themselves, defend themselves, or call for rescue when they are locked away. The duty falls on adults. In this case, that duty was abandoned, and after the child died, the truth was nearly erased. The jury's verdict, delivered into a room so quiet it seemed soundless, made sure it would not be erased again. After Tiffany Moss's conviction, it seemed impossible that another mother could match her silence or coldness. Yet the next case went beyond cruelty. It crossed into fanatic belief and delusion. A woman who claimed to hear God's voice, a so-called prophecy that turned deadly, and two missing children whose disappearance would shock the entire nation. This is the story of Vallow Daybell, the Doomsday Mother.
The search began in late 2019 when officers in Rexburg, Idaho performed a welfare check on two missing children, 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow and 17-year-old Caylee Ryan. Their mother, Lori Vallow, told police they were fine and staying with relatives, but every person she named denied it. The children were nowhere to be found. What made the situation even stranger was Lori's response. Rather than pleading for help or joining the search, she and her new husband, Chad Daybell, quietly left Idaho and were soon photographed in Hawaii, smiling on a beach while investigators searched for her children. The photos made national news. A mother under investigation for two missing children appeared carefree and unconcerned. Those who knew Lori said she had changed in the months before the disappearance. Once described as loving and protective, she had become fixated on apocalyptic teachings promoted by Chad, a religious author who claimed to receive visions from God. He preached about an approaching end of the world and told followers that some souls were light and others were dark. Lori adopted these beliefs fully, labeling people in her life, including her children, as either chosen or corrupted. Police soon realized the missing children were part of a much larger story, filled with sudden deaths, deceit, and fanatic belief. In July 2019, Lori's estranged husband, Charles Vallow, was shot by her brother, Alex Cox, in what Alex claimed was self-defense. Investigators reopened the case after inconsistencies appeared. 3 months later, Chad's wife, Tammy Daybell, died unexpectedly in her sleep. Within weeks, Lori and Chad married in Hawaii. That quick remarriage and their evasive behavior drew national attention.
Detectives pieced together a timeline that raised more questions. Caylee was last seen alive in early September 2019 during a family trip to Yellowstone National Park. JJ was seen days later at home with a friend. After that, both vanished. Lori told people Caylee was studying in another state and that JJ was staying with relatives, but none of it was true. Meanwhile, Lori continued collecting the children's Social Security benefits, a detail prosecutors would later cite as proof of motive. Behind the religious talk and false reassurances, investigators found a web of digital evidence connecting Lori, Chad, and her brother Alex. Messages described casting out dark spirits and referred to the children as zombies, language that stripped them of identity and, in the eyes of prosecutors, justified what came next.
Cell phone data placed Alex Cox at Chad Daybell's property in Rexburg on the exact days each child was last seen. Around those same dates, neighbors reported a large backyard fire on Chad's land. By early 2020, the story had exploded into headlines across the country. A court ordered Lori to produce the children within 5 days. She ignored it. When she was finally arrested in Hawaii and brought back to Idaho, she still refused to say where JJ and Caylee were. Search teams combed multiple states, following tips and leads that went nowhere. For months, the question haunted investigators and the public alike: where are the children? In June 2020, the answer was found. Acting on the cell phone data tied to Alex Cox, police executed a search warrant at Chad Daybell's property. Behind the house, they located 2 separate burial sites. Inside them were the remains of JJ Vallow and Caylee Ryan. The discovery confirmed the darkest fears. Lori and Chad's spiritual claims of saving souls were a disguise for murder. The story that had once sounded like a mystery had become a homicide case with clear evidence of planning, concealment, and motive.
The revelations shook even the most seasoned investigators. The couple's religious followers had believed they were leading a divine mission to gather chosen souls for the end of days. Instead, they had destroyed the very family they claimed to protect. Prosecutors revealed messages showing Chad calling Lori his eternal companion and predicting Tammy's death before it happened. Lori's brother Alex, who had carried out much of the physical work tied to the crimes, died suddenly in December 2019, closing one more chapter in the tangled chain of deaths around the couple. During Lori's trial, the courtroom saw a woman who still smiled and seemed unmoved by the charges. The defense argued she was manipulated by Chad and lost in delusion, but the prosecution showed that Lori had played an equal role, fully aware of the plan and its consequences. Witnesses testified about her calm attitude after the children disappeared, about her comments that they were happy and safe, even as investigators searched for them. The trial lasted several weeks and laid out a chilling sequence of events. The children vanished in September. Lori lied to friends, family, and police. She married Chad just weeks after his wife's suspicious death. She ignored every court order to produce her children, and when the truth came out, she maintained her faith in the same beliefs that had driven her to the brink. When the verdict was read in May 2023, the courtroom was silent. Lori Vallow Daybell was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and grand theft by deception. The judge spoke about her lack of remorse, her willingness to twist faith into justification, and her complete detachment from reality. He said the evidence showed a mother who placed herself and her delusions above her own children's lives.
In July 2023, Lori was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Chad Daybell, facing the same charges, awaits his separate trial, where prosecutors intend to seek the death penalty. Lori showed little reaction as the sentence was read, just as she had throughout the trial. The families of JJ and Caylee said they hoped the conviction would at least ensure their story would not be forgotten. What landed Lori Vallow Daybell in prison was not one spontaneous act, but a long pattern of choices rooted in obsession and belief. She followed a man who claimed to speak for God. She redefined right and wrong to fit a prophecy. She lied to everyone around her while continuing to benefit financially from her children's disappearance. In the end, the same calm she showed on a Hawaiian beach became the face of her downfall. A mother smiling while the truth waited to surface. The case of Lori Vallow Daybell is now one of the most haunting examples of faith turned fatal. It is a warning about the power of unchecked belief and manipulation. Behind the visions and the prophecies were 2 children who never had a choice. Their story remains a lesson in how conviction, when twisted by obsession, can lead to ruin, and how justice, even delayed,
can still find its way through the quietest lies. As investigators closed the chapter on Vallow Daybell, one truth stood out. Not every deadly obsession comes from faith or prophecy. Sometimes it grows quietly behind a screen, fed by attention and sympathy. The next case takes us into that world, where a mother's need for validation online led to the suffering of her own child. This is the story of Lacey Spears, the digital age Munchausen.
Guilty.
A New York State court convicts a woman of poisoning her son by force-feeding him heavy concentrations of sodium through a feeding tube.
It started as a story of a devoted single mother sharing her struggles online. Lacey Spears lived in New York and filled her social media pages with photos of her young son, Garnett, a blonde, smiling boy she called her little angel. She wrote about his frequent hospital visits, the medical battles he faced, and her strength in getting through them. Every post drew messages of sympathy and encouragement. Her followers praised her for her courage, calling her a warrior mom. They sent gifts, prayers, and emotional support. To outsiders, she was the image of devotion in the face of endless hardship. But behind the carefully framed pictures and heartfelt captions, something far darker was unfolding. By the time Garnett was 5, he had been in and out of hospitals more times than most adults. Lacey always seemed to be at his bedside, updating friends online about his latest health scare. The posts became her identity. Yet every time doctors ran tests, they found inconsistencies. Garnett's conditions never quite matched his symptoms. What puzzled them most was the extreme rise in his sodium levels, something they couldn't explain through illness alone. It was as if the salt was being introduced from outside his body. Medical staff began to grow suspicious. They noticed Lacey's constant presence and her control over every aspect of Garnett's care. She often argued with nurses and resisted when doctors tried to limit her involvement. When Garnett was admitted to Westchester Medical Center in 2014 after a severe seizure, the situation turned critical. Doctors suspected poisoning. They decided to monitor the room more closely. Investigators later discovered that Lacey had a long history of exaggerating illnesses, not her own, but her son's. She had moved several times, each time forming new circles of sympathy and support. Neighbors and acquaintances said she thrived on attention, especially the kind that came when people saw her as a struggling, selfless mother. Her social media presence was constant, filled with updates that seemed designed to elicit concern. What no one realized was that the drama she presented online was being staged in real life, at the expense of her child. In the hospital, medical staff installed hidden cameras in Garnett's room after the unexplained sodium spikes continued. The footage they captured revealed the truth. Lacey was seen taking a feeding tube connected to Garnett's stomach and pouring in a liquid from a separate container. Not long after, his condition worsened dramatically. Lab results confirmed extremely high sodium levels in his system, levels that could not have occurred naturally. Doctors fought to stabilize him, but the damage was irreversible. Garnett's brain had been fatally injured by the salt poisoning. He died on January 23, 2014. The discovery shocked not only the medical community, but also the thousands who had followed Lacey's story online. Her entire persona, the loving mother, the innocent victim of circumstance, collapsed overnight. Investigators searched her home and found containers of table salt and feeding supplies identical to those used at the hospital. Digital forensics uncovered search history about the effects of sodium on the human body, alongside years of social media posts chronicling her child's supposed illnesses.
Prosecutors argued that Lacey's motive was attention. She had built an identity around her son's suffering, feeding off the compassion of others. The more people sympathized, the more she exaggerated. The act of harming Garnett gave her the drama to post about and the sympathy that came with it. Psychologists later described it as a textbook case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a mental disorder in which a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in another person to gain attention. In court, the evidence was overwhelming. The video footage was played for the jury, showing Lacey handling the feeding tube in the moments before Garnett's condition declined. Experts testified that the child's symptoms matched acute sodium poisoning. The hospital's careful documentation, combined with the forensic analysis of Lacey's online behavior, drew a clear line between her need for attention and her son's suffering. Throughout the trial, Lacey sat quietly. She cried at times, but prosecutors argued that her emotion was not for her son, it was for herself. They pointed out that she had continued posting on social media even after Garnett's death, writing about her heartbreak and loss in ways that seemed more performative than sincere. Her followers, once a source of comfort, turned against her. The same online community she had used for validation became a public jury that condemned her actions. When the verdict came, the courtroom fell silent. Lacey Spears was found guilty of second-degree murder and first-degree manslaughter. The judge called her crime inexplicable and said it represented one of the most extreme forms of betrayal a parent could commit. He spoke of the calculated way she had used her son's illness for attention and the cold precision with which she had administered the salt.
In 2015, she was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison in New York. The judge noted that while Lacey did not receive the death penalty, her sentence would likely ensure she would never again harm another child. She showed little emotion as the decision was read. What placed Lacey Spears in prison was clear: the deliberate poisoning of her son with excessive sodium, disguised as a medical emergency, all for online sympathy. The case exposed the dark side of social media, the way validation can become an addiction, and empathy can be manipulated into applause. Lacey's obsession with attention had crossed into cruelty, turning a child's life into content for clicks and comments. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that not every post tells the truth. In the digital age, where emotion can be curated and sympathy can be collected like currency, Lacey Spears stands as a warning of what happens when the desire to be seen becomes more powerful than the duty to protect. Her son's story was not a tragedy of illness. It was a tragedy of attention. And it ended the moment the cameras caught what the world was never meant to see. As investigators closed the book on Lacey Spears, the world was left asking how a mother's love could turn so toxic. But the next case would ignite an even greater storm, one that split the nation and tested the limits of justice itself. A missing child, a web of lies, and a trial that became a media obsession. This is the story of Casey Anthony, the disappearance of Caylee.
For Anthony, who earlier this week was convicted of lying to police, but acquitted on charges of abusing and killing her 2-year-old daughter, Caylee. She was given 4 years on the lying charges, but with credit for time served, she only has...
It began with a missing child and a mother who didn't seem concerned. In June 2008, 2-year-old Caylee Anthony vanished from her home in Orlando, Florida. Her mother, Casey Anthony, went about her life as if nothing had happened, partying with friends, posting photos, and getting a new tattoo that read Bella Vita, meaning beautiful life. For a month, no one knew Caylee was gone. It wasn't until Casey's mother, Cindy Anthony, called 911 that the truth began to surface. Cindy's voice shook as she told the dispatcher her granddaughter had been missing for 31 days. What followed was one of the most infamous investigations in modern American history. From the beginning, Casey's behavior baffled investigators. When questioned by police,
She claimed that a nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez had kidnapped her daughter. She said she had been trying to find Caylee on her own, afraid to involve the authorities. The story fell apart quickly. Detectives searched for the nanny and discovered she didn't exist. The apartment where Casey said Zenaida lived was empty. The job Casey claimed to have at Universal Studios turned out to be a lie. She hadn't worked there for years. When officers asked her to show them her office, she actually walked them through the building until she finally admitted the truth. Casey's web of lies drew national attention. The image of a young mother lying about her missing child captivated and enraged the public. Reporters crowded outside the Anthony family home as investigators searched for evidence. Cadaver dogs alerted on Casey's car, specifically in the trunk, suggesting the presence of human decomposition. Forensic testing later found traces of chloroform and human hair consistent with Caylee's DNA. The results pointed toward one chilling conclusion: Caylee had been dead for some time. Casey maintained her innocence. She said her daughter was alive, that someone else had taken her, and that the evidence was being misinterpreted. Her parents stood by her at first, but tension within the family grew. Cindy and George Anthony, Casey's parents, gave emotional interviews begging for Caylee's return. Meanwhile, the media dissected every detail, portraying Caylee as the most hated woman in America.
In December 2008, 6 months after Caylee disappeared, a utility worker found a small bag in a wooded area less than a mile from the Anthony home. Inside were bones, a blanket, and duct tape. The remains were identified as Caylee's. The discovery confirmed what many already suspected, that the little girl was dead. Prosecutors moved quickly, charging Casey with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and manslaughter. The trial that followed in 2011 was broadcast live across the country. It became a cultural event, with millions watching every moment. The prosecution painted a picture of a selfish, deceitful woman who saw her daughter as a burden. They argued that Casey wanted freedom, and that she used chloroform and duct tape to kill Caylee before disposing of her body in the woods. They showed jurors the party photos taken during the month Caylee was missing, the tattoo, and the internet searches found on the family computer for terms like chloroform and how to make neck-breaking tools. The defense told a very different story. Casey's lawyer, Jose Baez, claimed that Caylee had accidentally drowned in the family pool and that Casey's father, George Anthony, helped cover it up. He suggested that Casey's history of lying stemmed from childhood trauma, not guilt. The prosecution called the drowning theory absurd, arguing there was no evidence to support it and that Casey's behavior after Caylee's disappearance, celebrating, shopping, and lying to everyone, was incompatible with grief.
Witness after witness took the stand. Friends testified that Casey rarely mentioned Caylee in the weeks she was missing. Forensic experts described the smell of decomposition in the car trunk and the duct tape found with Caylee's remains. But without clear proof of how Caylee died, the case remained circumstantial. The defense hammered that point repeatedly. No cause of death, no eyewitness, no confession. The nation waited as the jury deliberated. On July 5, 2011, the verdict was read. Casey Anthony was found not guilty of murder, not guilty of manslaughter, and not guilty of child abuse. The only convictions were for lying to police during the investigation. The courtroom gasped. Outside, protesters shouted in disbelief. News anchors called it one of the most shocking verdicts in recent memory. The prosecution had lost a case many thought was certain to end in conviction. Casey was sentenced to 4 years in prison for the 4 counts of lying to law enforcement, but was released shortly after due to time already served. The public outrage did not fade. People questioned the jury's reasoning, accusing them of ignoring the evidence. Some jurors later explained that they believed Casey was responsible in some way, but that the state had not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. What landed Casey Anthony in jail was not the death of her daughter, at least not legally, but her lies. She fabricated a nanny, a job, and an entire story that wasted precious weeks of the investigation. Her deceit delayed the search for Caylee and misled everyone trying to help. Although acquitted of murder, the damage was done. Her reputation was destroyed, and her name became synonymous with guilt in the court of public opinion. After her release, Casey lived quietly in Florida, avoiding the media for years. She later gave interviews insisting she did not harm her daughter, saying she would never have done anything to hurt Caylee. But for much of the world, her words rang hollow. The case remains a symbol of the divide between legal truth and emotional truth. In the eyes of the law, Casey Anthony walked free. In the eyes of the public, she never will. Caylee's death was never officially explained, leaving behind a story that continues to haunt those who followed it. What began as the disappearance of a child became a reflection of a justice system struggling to reconcile evidence with doubt, and a reminder that even when a courtroom delivers a verdict, it doesn't always deliver closure. As the nation tried to move past the chaos of the Casey Anthony trial, another case emerged that was darker and more disturbing. One that didn't unfold in a courtroom at first, but inside a quiet suburban garage. What police found there would stun even the most seasoned detectives. This is the story of Megan Huntsman, the Garage of Secrets.
It started with a spring cleaning that no one in Pleasant Grove, Utah will ever forget. A quiet suburban street, lined with identical houses and freshly cut lawns, suddenly became the center of a horror no one could have imagined. On an ordinary April morning in 2014, a man began sorting through boxes in his garage, the one he used to share with his wife, Megan Huntsman. Buried behind years of clutter, he came across a small cardboard box, sealed with tape, and oddly heavy for its size. Curious, he opened it, and what he found inside stopped him cold. Within minutes, police sirens filled the street. Neighbors peeked through blinds, unaware that this house, the one they'd waved to for years, was hiding one of the darkest secrets the town had ever seen. When detectives entered the garage, they began to search methodically. Another box appeared, then another, and another. By the end of the day, 7 boxes had been found, each containing the remains of a newborn child, each one sealed, hidden, and left to sit for years only feet from where Megan once parked her car. To everyone who knew her, Megan Huntsman was an ordinary mother. She had 3 daughters, a quiet demeanor, and a husband who had struggled with addiction and time behind bars. No one suspected the private life she lived when the curtains were drawn. Over the course of 10 years, between 1996 and 2006, Megan had secretly given birth 7 times. No hospital visits, no records, no baby showers, just silence, concealment, and a deadly pattern that repeated itself again and again.
When investigators questioned her, Megan didn't deny a thing. In a tone that unsettled everyone in the room, she calmly explained what she had done. She said her first child was stillborn, but the others, 6 of them, she ended their lives moments after birth. She claimed she couldn't handle more children, that she was consumed by addiction, that she simply couldn't stop the cycle once it began. Each time, she would hide the body, wrap it carefully, and place it inside a box in the garage. Then she'd go back to her daily life, as if nothing had happened. The most haunting part wasn't just the act itself, it was the silence that surrounded it. She shared that same house with her husband and 3 daughters. None of them knew. They slept under the same roof, while the evidence of her secret sat just a few feet away. When her husband, Darren West, was questioned, he told detectives he never suspected she was pregnant. Her weight fluctuated, her behavior seemed normal, and he assumed any changes were linked to drinking. The truth was unthinkable. Megan had hidden every pregnancy, every labor, every death, without anyone noticing. Investigators tried to understand how a person could live like that for 10 years. The forensic team confirmed that all 7 infants were fathered by Darren West. The decomposition made it difficult to determine exactly how each had died, but Megan's own confession was enough. What she described was not a single act of panic, it was a decade-long pattern. Pleasant Grove was in shock. Neighbors, who once waved to her from their lawns, struggled to comprehend how something so terrible could happen right next door. To them, Megan had always been polite, even shy. The realization that she had carried such darkness behind that quiet smile left the entire community haunted.
When it came time for sentencing in 2015, the courtroom was silent. Megan Huntsman stood before the judge, head lowered, expression unreadable. The prosecution detailed her actions, calling her crimes beyond comprehension. The judge agreed, describing them as horribly cold. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, Megan chose to plead guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder, sparing her surviving children the trauma of a public trial. When asked if she had anything to say, her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." It was the only statement she gave. The sentence was delivered. 6 concurrent terms of 15 years to life in prison. The judge made it clear that she would likely never leave prison walls. Megan Huntsman was led away in handcuffs, calm as always. Today, she remains behind bars in Utah, serving out her sentence in near isolation. The house where it all happened has long since changed owners, but neighbors say the memory of that day still lingers. The thought that a mother could carry such a secret for 10 years, giving birth, taking life, and hiding the truth mere feet from her family, still chills the town of Pleasant Grove. Megan Huntsman's story isn't one of madness or sudden rage. It's the story of control taken to its darkest extreme. A mother who decided that silence was easier than confession, and secrecy more comfortable than motherhood itself. In that quiet garage, surrounded by the ordinary mess of suburban life, she built her own private graveyard. And for 10 long years, she lived right beside it. After hearing these cases, I can't help but ask, were these women truly evil, or did society help make them that way? Everyone calls them monsters, but maybe the real horror is how easily warning signs were ignored. We scream for justice when a mother kills, but when a father does, we call it tragedy. Why the double standard? Some say they deserve no sympathy. Others say they broke under pressure no one could survive. But what if both are true? Tell me, are these women proof that evil hides behind love, or proof that our system fails before it saves? Drop your thoughts below, because your answer says more about you than you think. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.